Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today we're gonna be diving into biblical prophecy.
Ooh, okay.
Specifically, prophecies that people claim have already happened.
Right.
We're using a YouTube video as our guide. It's from this channel called Radio Solidaria.
Okay.
And the video's title is Profecia Bíblica, Profecías de la Biblia que se han cumplido.
So basically biblical prophecy.
Yeah.
Prophecies of the Bible that have been fulfilled.
Exactly.
Got it.
So right off the bat, the video kind of points out just how much of the Bible is dedicated to prophecy.
Yeah, it's not just like a couple of verses here and there.
No, it's like a huge chunk of the text.
The video says it's something like between a fourth and a third.
Wow, and there's even this whole encyclopedia by Barton Payne.
Really?
Yeah, it's all about biblical prophecy, and it lists over 1,800 predictions about the future.
Wow, that's wild. I mean, where do you even begin to make sense of all that?
I know, right? So the video, it focuses on what they call Messianic prophecies, right? And these are prophecies that are specifically about the coming of Jesus.
Right.
They say the Old Testament, which was written centuries before Jesus, refers to his coming over 300 times.
Wow, over 300 times. That's a pretty big claim.
It is. So, okay, let's just say, hypothetically, somebody could fulfill a bunch of these prophecies.
Fine.
Just by pure chance, right? What are the chances of that actually happening with so many specific predictions?
Well, this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The video talks about this mathematician named Peter Stoner.
Uh-huh.
He basically calculated the probability of just 48 of these prophecies all being fulfilled by a single person.
Okay.
And get this, he said the odds are like 1 in 10 to the power of 157.
I'm no mathematician, but even I know that is an incredibly tiny number.
Right. To give you an idea, it'd be like trying to find one specific electron in the entire universe and finding it on your first try.
So basically, the video is saying that if somebody fulfilled all these prophecies, it's pretty much a mathematical miracle. But how do they actually connect those Old Testament verses to events that happened in Jesus's life?
Right. So let's take a look at a couple of examples.
Okay.
So first they talk about the prophecy of the Messiah being born of a virgin.
Okay.
They quote Isaiah 7.12, where it says, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Then they go to the New Testament.
Okay.
Matthew 1.23, which describes the virgin birth of Jesus.
Oh, so they're drawing a direct line between those two verses.
Exactly.
Even though they were written hundreds of years apart.
Yeah, and they give a few other examples too, like Micah 5.2.
Okay.
It says that the ruler of Israel will be from Bethlehem.
Right.
And then they connect that to verses like Matthew 2.6,
Right.
which talks about the wise men going to Bethlehem.
To see the newborn king.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting.
So they're not just saying that Jesus happened to be born in Bethlehem.
They're saying it was a fulfillment of that specific prophecy.
Exactly.
Do they do this with other parts of his life too?
Yeah, they do. They also use Hosea 11.1, which mentions God calling his son out of Egypt.
Right.
And they tie that to Matthew 2.1 through 15, where Joseph, Mary, and Jesus have to flee to Egypt because of Herod.
So they're basically saying that even Jesus's childhood was full of these events that were predicted in the Old Testament.
Right. And then they even go on to talk about prophecies that were about Jesus' ministry.
Okay.
Like Isaiah 9.1 to 2,
Okay.
which talks about a great light coming to Galilee.
Right.
They link that to Matthew 4.12, where Jesus starts his ministry in Galilee after John the Baptist is arrested.
It's like they're putting together a puzzle, with
Yeah.
each prophecy and event making this bigger picture.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
What about the prophecies about Jesus's death and all that?
Well, they do bring up a few of those too.
Okay.
Like, for instance, they talk about Isaiah 53.4 to 5, which
Yeah.
says the Messiah will bear our sicknesses and carry our sorrows.
Yeah, I remember that verse.
And then they connect that to all the stories in the Gospels about Jesus healing people.
Right, so it's not just about the places he went or the circumstances of his birth.
Mm-hmm.
It's about his actions, too.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what else? Well, there's Psalm 41.9 and Zechariah 11.10-13,
Okay.
which talk about the prophecy of betrayal by a friend for 30 pieces of silver.
Right, and that connects to Judas betraying Jesus.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then finally, there's the prophecy in Zechariah 12.10 and Psalm 22.1 cest about the piercing of the Messiah's side,
Right.
which they connect to the Roman soldier piercing Jesus' side with a spear after the crucifixion.
It's amazing to think that something written hundreds of years earlier could seemingly predict all these events in such detail.
Right.
But they don't just stop there, do they?
No, they don't.
They go on to talk about this really complex prophecy from the book of Daniel.
Oh, yeah. Daniel 9.24.
That one.
It mentions 70 weeks, and how it relates to when the Messiah would arrive and to the idea of reconciliation with God.
I always found that one to be super complicated.
It is a tricky one.
So how does the video try to explain it?
Well, they say this prophecy is pointing to Jesus dying for the sins of the world.
Okay.
And that's what fulfills this idea of reconciliation.
Right.
And then they link this back to all those calls to repentance and belief in the gospel that you find in the New Testament.
Okay.
It's like Mark 1.15 and Acts 2.38.
So they're not just saying that Daniel's prophecy predicted an event.
Nope.
It's about connecting it to a deeper spiritual meaning.
Exactly.
And then they get even more specific with Daniel's prophecy.
Right.
They focus on the 69 weeks or 483 prophetic years that are mentioned in that verse.
Yeah.
And they say those years come before the Messiah's work of reconciliation.
Right.
So they use that time frame along with the fact that Jesus was baptized at age 30, according to Luke 3.23.
Yeah.
And based on all that, they place Jesus's birth around 4 BC.
That's a pretty specific claim.
It is. It's like they're using this ancient prophecy to pinpoint a date in history.
It really makes you think.
It does. And it really highlights how much interpretation plays a role in all of this.
For sure.
I mean, how we understand these prophecies and whether we see them as fulfilled or not.
Yeah.
It really depends on our own beliefs and how we interpret these texts.
Exactly. And, even with all these connections the video is making, there's definitely still room for debate and different perspectives.
Totally. And it's important to remember that the video doesn't just focus on prophecies that are about Jesus.
Right.
They also use the example of the fall of Babylon to kind of illustrate this bigger point about God's involvement in world affairs.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
But we'll dig into that more after a quick break.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we just saw how this video connects Old Testament prophecies to events in Jesus's life.
Right, even like specific dates and places.
But then they also talk about prophecies that are about like whole empires.
Yeah.
They use the fall of Babylon as an example. How it was once this massive, powerful empire.
Yeah, like the empire.
But then it totally collapsed.
It's a great example of how God can step in, intervene in human affairs.
Even when it seems like empires are calling the shots.
Exactly.
I remember learning about Babylon in history class,
Yeah.
It seemed like an unstoppable force.
Totally.
So how could the Bible have predicted its fall way back then when it was at the peak of its power?
Right. Well, that's what makes the prophecy so interesting, right? The video points out that the prophet Isaiah actually names Cyrus.
Cyrus?
Yeah, the Persian king, who eventually conquers Babylon.
Okay.
Isaiah names him over 100 years before Cyrus was even born.
Seriously?
Yeah, it's in Isaiah 44.28 if you want to look it up.
Naming someone before they're even born, that's some serious foresight.
It really is. And the prophecies about Babylon get even more specific.
Oh, yeah.
Like how?
Well, they describe how Cyrus would divert the Euphrates River in order to get into the city.
Whoa.
It's in Isaiah 45.1 through 3.
Wow. And is there any proof of that?
Well, get this.
Okay.
The Greek historian Herodotus actually wrote about Cyrus conquering Babylon.
And he mentions how Cyrus diverted the Euphrates River.
So it's not just like a story in the Bible.
Nope.
It's corroborated by actual historical accounts.
Exactly. The video uses this as an example of how biblical prophecy can actually line up with documented history.
That's pretty cool.
It is. But it's also important to remember that, like with the prophecies about Jesus, these interpretations can be debated.
Right.
There are different perspectives on these historical events.
Totally. Okay, so we have this prophecy about Cyrus conquering Babylon.
Right.
What's the other example?
So in addition to the Cyrus prophecy, the video also talks about the story of Belshazzar's feast.
Oh, yeah, in Daniel 5.
Yeah. Remember that story? The king throws this huge party.
Yeah.
And he's completely ignoring all of Daniel's warnings.
Right.
And then all of a sudden...
the handwriting on the wall.
Exactly. It's a super dramatic story.
Yeah. Especially that part where no one can even figure out what the writing means until Daniel shows up.
Right. It's such a powerful image, this invincible king.
Yeah.
Totally brought down by a message he can't even understand.
It's pretty humbling.
It is. The video uses this story as an example of God's judgment and how God can intervene,
right,
even in the midst of a powerful empire that thinks it doesn't need God.
Like a reminder that money and power don't equal security.
Exactly. And this ties back to the video's overall message, that God is still involved in world affairs, even if it doesn't always seem that way.
Right.
They also briefly mentioned some prophecies about more modern empires, like the British and American empires.
Interesting.
Suggesting that God's influence extends throughout history, right up to today.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
It seems like the video is ultimately leading up to this idea of Jesus' second coming.
Yeah, that's right.
They bring up that idea of Jesus establishing an eternal kingdom.
Like it says in Isaiah 9:6-7.
So they're basically saying that all these seemingly separate prophecies, about Jesus, about Babylon, even about modern empires, they're all connected to this bigger story about God's plan for the world.
Exactly. And they even link it to a call to action.
What do you mean?
Well, they emphasize that we should be prepared for this coming kingdom.
Okay.
By following Jesus' teachings and by seeking God's will, like it says in Matthew 6.10 and 6.33.
So it's not just about figuring out the past.
Right.
It's about understanding what these prophecies might mean for us now and for our future.
Exactly. It's about how we live our lives today.
But how does all this relate to someone listening right now? Someone who maybe isn't that familiar with biblical prophecy?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think the takeaway here, no matter what someone believes, is that engaging with these prophecies, it can be a really fascinating exercise in critical thinking.
Right. It's not about just blindly accepting one interpretation.
Exactly.
It's about asking questions and exploring different perspectives and trying to figure out how these ancient texts could still be relevant to us today.
It encourages us to dig deeper into history, faith, and how we interpret things.
Yeah. It's like we're on an archaeological dig, carefully uncovering these layers of meaning and trying to put together this bigger picture.
That's a great analogy.
So what do you think the video gets right?
Well, I think they do a good job of highlighting just how many prophecies there are in the Bible.
Yeah.
And how detailed they are, especially the ones about Jesus.
Right.
Even if you're skeptical, the number of specific predictions that seem to line up with events in his life is pretty amazing.
I agree. And they make some interesting connections between prophecy and history, too. Like that whole thing with the fall of Babylon and Cyrus diverting the Euphrates River.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, what about some potential problems with the video's approach?
Okay, yeah. What do you think?
Well, for one thing, they kind of present their interpretations as the only right ones.
Yeah.
Without really acknowledging that there's a lot of debate around biblical prophecy.
Right. They don't really leave much room for nuance or alternative viewpoints.
Not really. And they also rely heavily on taking the text literally, which can be a bit problematic.
Because context is so important, right?
Exactly. A verse taken out of context can easily be misinterpreted.
Yeah, I think they also could have spent more time really explaining the complexities of Daniel's prophecy.
Agreed, especially since it's such a key part of their argument.
What do you think? What stands out to you as a potential weak point?
I think the video's emphasis on predicting the future, especially when it comes to the second coming, might be a bit misleading.
Right, because biblical prophecy isn't just about fortune-telling.
Exactly.
It's often about conveying these deeper spiritual messages.
Yes.
And encouraging people to live differently.
Right. So while the video does a good job of getting people interested in prophecy, I think it's important for listeners to do their own research and come to their own conclusions.
Absolutely. We're all on this journey of discovery together.
For sure.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a question that the video didn't really cover.
Sounds good.
But that came up for us as we were exploring all this.
Okay.
If we think about the idea that some of these prophecies actually have come true, what could that tell us about the future?
That's a great question.
What other events might these ancient texts be foreshadowing?
Yeah.
And how might that change how we see the world and our place in it?
Those are definitely some things to think about.
These are questions we'll keep wrestling with.
Yeah.
And we encourage you to do the same.
Absolutely.
But for now, we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Thanks for joining us on this fascinating exploration of biblical prophecy.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
We hope this episode has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep asking questions.
Definitely.
Until next time.
Keep exploring, keep thinking critically.
And most importantly, keep the conversation going.
It's pretty wild to think about how these, ancient prophecies could still be relevant to us today.
Right.
What do you think it is about these kinds of predictions that people find so fascinating, even in our, modern tech-driven world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it maybe speaks to this, deep human need to understand the future
Yeah.
to know what's coming next, you know?
Right, like to have some kind of control.
Yeah, and prophecy offers this
Yeah.
glimpse into the unknown,
Right?
which can be like both comforting and kind of scary at the same time.
Totally. It's like we're trying to find these patterns in the chaos,
Uh-huh.
looking for clues about where our lives are going, where the world's headed.
Yeah, like searching for meaning.
And that idea that maybe some events are like predetermined
Yeah.
or part of a bigger plan, it can be a pretty powerful concept.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it also brings up some tricky questions.
Like what?
Well, like the whole free will versus destiny thing.
Yeah, all right.
If certain events are already set in stone, does that mean we don't really have a choice in how we live?
Yeah, or can we still make our own choices within that like bigger framework?
Yeah. Big question.
Definitely. And it's something that comes up a lot when people talk about biblical prophecy, especially with the second coming of Jesus.
Right, right.
The video seems to be saying that we might be living in those, what do they call them, the end times.
Mm-hmm.
But what does that even mean, practically speaking?
Well, that's a question with a lot of different interpretations, right? Some people think the end times refers to a specific period
Okay.
of like tribulation and upheaval leading up to Jesus' return,
Okay.
while others see it more as this gradual unfolding of God's plan throughout history.
So maybe it's not about trying to predict a specific date
Right.
or a set of events,
Yeah.
but more about understanding what these prophecies mean on a deeper spiritual level.
I think that's a good way to put it.
And that's maybe where the video's message about preparing for this coming kingdom becomes relevant,
Right.
whether or not you believe in a literal second coming.
Yeah.
That idea of like living a life that aligns with your values and trying to make a positive impact,
Uh-huh.
that's a pretty universal message.
It is. It reminds us that we all have a part to play in shaping the future.
Right, no matter what we believe about prophecy or the end times.
Exactly. And I think even if you're skeptical, engaging with these prophecies can be a good way to reflect on those bigger questions.
Like how we want to live our lives.
Yeah, and what kind of world we want to create.
It's like holding up a mirror to ourselves.
Yeah. To our values and priorities.
It makes us think about the difference between what we say we believe and how we actually act.
Right. And how we can close that gap.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about.
It has.
And we hope it's done the same for you.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
It's been a really fascinating journey exploring these ancient prophecies and how people interpret them
For sure.
and what they might mean for us today.
And remember, the conversation doesn't have to end here.
Yeah, definitely.
If you're interested in these ideas, there are so many resources out there that can help you explore them further.
Totally. From scholarly articles to podcasts just like ours.
Yeah, keep learning and keep asking questions.
So, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Yeah, thanks again.
We hope this episode has sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to keep thinking critically about the world around us.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep the conversation going, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.